Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and this is your overview for the month of February 2020. So there's a bunch of good transits happening this month. I've got a lot on my list. It's not quite as flashy as the month of January because in January we featured, arguably the biggest transit of the year, which was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. But the effect of that transit is still washing over us right now, and we have another big month of astrology to take a look at. And we can kind of consider that Saturn and Pluto is in the background, like the resonance of a gong still spreading out, or the ripples in the pond when you throw a stone in still spreading out, and will be through the rest of the year. So the month starts, on the heels of this major Saturn Pluto transit, and that's, maybe just it's worth starting with that we're all sort of still reeling from some of the experiences in January, which were very powerful. Some of the things that you saw in the news were very powerful. Depending on where these planets fall in your birth chart, they could have been impacting you at a very personal level as well. So we're going to start with, I think, one of the biggest transits to start the month, which comes on February 3rd. What we see on February 3rd is that the planet Mercury is changing signs into Pisces. This is not going to be an easy transit for Mercury for a couple of reasons. One is moving into the sign of its fall, which means that anything that Mercury signifies or symbolizes is, you could say, in some ways falling on hard times, or will be compromised, or is having to work through some kind of setback or some atmosphere or environment that is challenging or conflicted in some way. Those are the kinds of things that Mercury symbolizes, and that would go for environments that have to do with learning, communicating, technology, travel, and in some ways our mental and emotional health as well. Now, when Mercury enters its fall in Pisces, the other reason that this is so significant is that later in the month, Mercury is going to turn retrograde in the sign of Pisces. A retrograde Mercury in the sign of its fall, not easy, right? When Mercury enters into its fall in Pisces on the 3rd of February, we're starting a process that's going to be going on all month long that includes a Mercury retrograde in Pisces. You go back to the retrograde that was happening last year in February with Mercury in the sign of Pisces. You could do a little comparing. Think back to what Mercury retrograde was like last winter for you, and you might be in the ballpark. For example, for myself, I was on my way back from India, and I ended up getting stuck in because there was a conflict between India and Pakistan. Our airplane suddenly landed out of nowhere in like Dubai or something. No, not Dubai. I want to say, where was it? It was some other country though. It was like we went, then we took off again, and there was some way we had to fly around Pakistan. So the flight turned from like 15 hours into 24. I'm not joking. And then after that, I missed my layover. The line to get into the layover was ridiculous. There ended up having been a 20-hour layover between like Delhi and Calcutta. And then I finally came back home. I didn't have a way of getting home, so I had to rent a car and drive the last 4 hours from New York City back to Baltimore. So I'll just tell you right now that it was definitely a crazy Mercury retrograde. One of the one of the worst travel stories in my entire life. But all of this is just to say that like this Mercury retrograde can be a little bit more on the difficult side. Now, for me, it was a travel story and a little bit of a health story. And I ended up getting, both of my feet were like badly swollen because of the long amount of time in the air that I spent over several days. So my feet, which are a Pisces ruled thing, were impacted by this transit as well. Anyway, the 3rd is when Mercury enters its fall in Pisces. The next thing that happens is, I'm just going to move this forward and talk about the whole transit. You get to like the 16th, 17th of the month, and you're going to see Mercury stationing. And that's where, okay, here's Mercury, and Mercury is going to start retrograde, and then it'll be in its retrograde the rest of the month in Pisces. So, as far as I'm concerned, this means that as soon as Mercury enters Pisces on the 3rd of the month, the process of the debilitated Mercury stuff should start appearing. Now, on the other hand, the positive in this, just not to be so entirely negative, is that Mercury in Jupiter's sign has some reception with Jupiter right now in the sign of Capricorn. And Mercury is also coming into contact with Neptune, which means that this could be a time of rapid advancement or development for spiritual studies, for spiritual practices, for things like intuition and the development of one's emotional intelligence, learning something that's mystical, philosophical, or religious. So, there's also the potential for this to have an impact on the mind's imaginative abilities, being able to renew or restore one's faith, you know, envisioning, hypnotism, altered states of consciousness. These kinds of things could also be quite strong with the influence of Neptune and the reception with Jupiter. So could be kind of a magical month. Thing you have to watch out for with this Mercury retrograde this month is that communication, there can be elements of deception, illusion, and we can essentially go through some, some space of having to get clear or honest or see things clearly when maybe there's been some fog of illusion around us, or even someone who's been that we're dealing with in our life who may not be emotionally or mentally stable or something like that. So all right, so that's the first thing. Mercury retrograde, Mercury entering its fall, a difficult patch for Mercury ruled things in February. Now there are some other things that are kind of that stand out this month. That was one of the major ones. Let's see if I can go here. So go to February 7th. The other thing that's happening this month that's a little rugged is Venus is entering the sign of Aries. So as soon as Venus ever enters Aries or Scorpio, Venus is moving into a sign of debility, which means that there can be, for example, we can, with Venus in its detriment, we can deal with conflicted Venusian things. So whether that's relationships with friends, the topic of women, the topic of love and sexuality, topic of beauty, our aesthetic, our style, our taste. Here's the thing is that like a lot of people really impulsively want to make these big decisions about, it's like everyone comes out of the woodwork to make bad style choices, get the wrong tattoo, have some kind of bodily procedure done that doesn't end up looking right, or so you have to be really careful about, doing big Venus things, even like buying furniture or artwork. Sometimes it's going to be the wrong thing. It's going to look conflicted, or I had a Venus one time we installed, and we got it because it was like the kind that we liked, that looked good. And then what ended up happening was, despite the carpet sort of looking good, it wasn't very, I just want to say like well designed, I guess. It just didn't hold together very well. And that was a big, like eye-opening moment for me about dealing with buying, like beautifying things for the home or the body when Venus is debilitated. And you'll see this a lot when people are working with magic as well. They'll say, traditionally for thousands of years, in fact, astrologers who practice magic are like, don't do Venus spells when Venus is debilitated. So at any rate, Venus in Aries will be a theme this month, starting on the 7th. And it can mean that there's a certain degree of conflict, hostility, or misfortune, or difficulty just in general surrounding anything Venusian. So hopefully I've kind of covered the range of things, but that could include, again, romantic relationships, sisters, friends, lovers. It can also mean that there's a theme of, like sometimes Venus and Aries will point on a more constructive note to things like feminism, the feminine and the warrior archetype combining, and the sort of battle of the sexes. And sometimes it can also represent kind of like the dangerous woman, or the temptress, or the goddess who tempts you in and destroys. Some of the Indian goddesses that are a bit like that. And also the way in which we use Venusian things, whether it's money or sex or beauty, um, to get something that we want, which is a very Aries Mars-like quality. So those things a little, there's a little bit, it's sort of dicey around Venus starting on the 7th. But there's going to be some interesting transits later in the month that I think that this Venus is going to work through that should be really, really interesting, and will make the story somewhat more, complex. So if I move forward, for example, to the 23rd to the 28th of the month, do that right now. I'll put it right about in the middle, 23rd to the 28th. Here's Venus in Aries, and it's Venus in Aries is going to go through squares to both Pluto and Jupiter in Capricorn. And so this is, this is one of those combinations where, when Venus gets into the square with Jupiter and Pluto, there's several more layers of symbolic meaning that come into play. For example, women in faith, women in religion, women in the law, women and politics, women in philosophy, women in, mysticism. You get kind of almost like a Joan of Arc figure with Venus in Aries squared to Jupiter in Capricorn, the feeling of, the topics of relationships, sex, love, beauty, and things like morality, ethics, the law, power, and philosophy, religion. Those topics can be really, they could show up really strongly. And also then the square to Pluto, which is about the death and rebirth, the intensification of Venusian things around sex, around pleasure, around beauty, around, harmonize your relationships, whether it's friendships or love, and some death and rebirth process that may take place. And that'll be, between like the, let's say, 23rd when Venus squares Jupiter and the 28th when Venus squares Pluto, but even a few days after that, because then Venus into March is going to go right into a square with Saturn. So some big lessons around Venus in the next month, and likely that it will also involve some degree of conflict or confrontation around Venusian themes. I would say spiritually, morally, ethically, academically, intellectually, just like Venus is not only the subject of the action, but is the subject of a kind of contemplation or reflectiveness that's happening this month. So interesting to see that. So that's my Venus story for the month. You go back towards the beginning of the month and you look, you'll notice that really on February 9th, let's see if I can get this right. All right, there we go. Got the full moon coming through. Do I have that right? It's on the 9th. I think it's going to be pretty early in the morning on the 9th. Yeah, let's check that out just to be sure. Just do a double take on this real quick. So yeah, we're going to see the perfection on the 9th, very early in the morning, 3:30 in the morning or so around here in Baltimore. But yeah, so on the 9th, it will come through, and full moon in the sign of Leo, with the sun obviously in Aquarius. This full moon energy is interesting because the moon and sun both have pretty close aspects to Mars. Feels like it could be a pretty fiery full moon, maybe with egos on display, the feeling of sort of cockiness and charm, and also leaders and like leaders in war, leaders in combat. You get that kind of feeling from, the moon being in the royal solar sign of Leo, but a trine feeding into Mars and Sagittarius. So kind of get a victorious but potentially big ego kind of mood, and more boisterous and kind of over the top, or strong and muscular and sort of sunny around the full moon. But it will be in contrast. You'll be feeling this. This is also a theme of insiders versus outsiders with the sun in Aquarius right now. So, probably you're going to be looking at the topic of, the upstart, the kind of the rebel that is gaining popularity, but is something of an outsider. can see this in the political races here, wouldn't surprise me. And also some question about, in general, around the full moon, about our egos and what is the appropriate way to use the will in the world around us, our individual sphere of life. How do we have a healthy ego on board and some healthy sense of strength in who we are and what we believe, and how are we wielding that? How are we showing that? And what is it doing to us? For some of us, we're black sheep. For some others are leaders in the family or in their community or at work. But questions about ego, who we are not, insiders and outsiders, the appropriate expression of strength and self-confidence. I see those themes as being pretty important right around the full moon. All right. From there, I think some of the themes kind of continue into the middle of the month when you see on the 16th and the 17th, you're going to see an interesting moment where where is it? Yeah, there's 16th and 17th, the Sun and Uranus, here we are making an antisha with one another. And I've explained the concept of antisha in previous videos. If you go back to one that I did on final thoughts or reflections on Saturn and Pluto, I explained the concept of antisha at the beginning. Special kind of relationship between the Sun and Uranus called an antisha taking place on the 16th and 17th that could provide us with insight, epiphanies. You ever feel like some days all of a sudden it's like somehow the sky just started through the sun spots, the solar flares, whatever they are, you've been somehow infused with some kind of cosmic energy drink. That could be like a Sun Uranus antisha. So I would encourage everyone to pay attention to the middle of the month for kind of a burst of insight. Might be a little defiant, original, may have a kind of breakthrough moment, and the need for greater freedom is there. A little bit careful about the rebel motif this month, and the balance between how to fit in and be liked and how to go out on a limb and take a risk and not care what other people think about you. The balance between those two things, I think, vis-a-vis the full moon is important. This transit kind of highlights more of the rebel, the outsider, someone who wants to make a statement. Maybe with Uranus and Taurus, we're looking for a way to do it that is just a little bit more beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. But there's some very original, inventive, erratic, and provocative energy around the middle of the month with the Sun hitting the antisha to Uranus. So let's see, we go forward from there. Where am I? You're on Mars 16th. Mars 16th, March, around February 16th. Sorry, tongue-tied. The other thing that's going to happen is you might notice right around the 16th that Mars is popping into the sign of Capricorn. So here's Mars in Capricorn, and you're going to have Mars ingressing into the sign of Capricorn around the 17th, where it is then in the sign of its exaltation. Then, if you take it forward just a few days, you're going to see Mars trine Uranus by February 21st. So between the 17th and the 21st, Mars gains a huge amount of dignity, goes into its exaltation, and immediately into a trine with Uranus. Okay, so that burst of creative energy around the middle of the month is immediately being put into actionable steps. There's some concrete way in which we're saying, now I'm starting, boom, this new thing is happening. And Mars will bring this need to be very productive, practical, hardworking, and Uranus will bring the burst of energy to break through limits and barriers, to be avant-garde, or to pour a little gasoline on the fire, so to speak, where it's like, all right, I've got something to prove, and now I'm like almost like the bang of a gun going off at the beginning of a race. That's what this feels like. And the other thing that's so nice about a Mars-Uranus trine is Mars-Uranus together can be sometimes like a NASCAR accident where the driver crashes 8 cars and then a tire flies off and hits someone, or it's like can be like wreckage, right? But when you get the trine, typically trines are of the nature of Jupiter, you start picking up an expansive energy, an affirming, supporting, growing, cohering energy. And with Mars, that means, asserting ourselves with a lot of that sort of practical, hardworking, mature, serious, results-oriented Saturn energy behind Capricorn. And then it just picks up the electricity, the enthusiasm, the rebelliousness of Uranus and Taurus. So that's what's happening between like the 17th and the 21st for Mars. I have that down as another really big one this month. Around the 20th, there's another interesting transit, which is coming, and that's coming from, there we go, Jupiter in the sign of Capricorn and Neptune in the sign of Pisces. So you see the sextile between the two of them forming. Sextiles, they aren't like the strongest aspects in the world, but Jupiter Neptune tends to start harmonizing things politically, morally, philosophically, ideologically. We start to see a growing theme of religious, spiritual, or philosophical sentiment. Sometimes there's this sense of ideas flowing into our life, or information flowing into our life that's changing our outlook, that's guiding us spiritually or morally somehow. Sometimes people start seeing therapists, they find a new teacher or a guru, they find they find an educational path or program of some kind. There's some sense of faith being healed or restored. There's some sense of also potentially being, with Neptune, being taken in and sort of diluted by something, something that's romantic but maybe unrealistic in some way, or with Jupiter in Capricorn in its fall with Pluto, could be sort of heavy-handed. For example, something that's fanatical, right? So those are some of the themes of Jupiter and Neptune, and you have to watch for things that get big beyond the container and sort of break or spill over with hubris and some kind of more humiliating or humbling event. So be careful also about just sort of overdoing things and the way things can spill over. Then let's see, so around the 23rd, the next big event that I have is the new moon in the sign of Pisces. So you can see the new moon right there in the sign of Pisces as Mercury is retrograde. Big Jupiterian themed month, from February going into March. Anytime you get a Jupiter theme with reception to Jupiter, that there's going to be a lot of positive, constructive Jupiterian development. That means learning. That means things related to due process or the legal process. That means ideas and faith in action. That means, education. It means your moral universe and the way that it's supporting you is your guidance system philosophically, your commitment spiritually, ethically. Those kinds of things should be a big part of the story for the next moon cycle ahead, starting with this new moon in Pisces, as well as themes of faith and healing, restoring of faith, building something from the ground up and having to dig down and find faith to do it. So those are some things coming through with the new moon in Pisces. I think maybe the only other thing that I find interesting is Mercury Kazemi on the 25th. I thought that's kind of neat because right on the 25th, and sometimes I miss things, but not a lot in the late end of the month. Here we have Mercury retrograde coming into the heart of the sun on the 25th. It could be a moment where Mercury starts to recover. So if that Mercury retrograde energy is really throwing you for a loop this month, just remember that the Kazemi moment on the 25th should indicate the beginning of some phase of empowerment and recovery. But we do have to see Mercury back out of Pisces, turn around and go back through Pisces. So got a little ways to go with a difficult Mercury situation coming up. Now, let's see here. So the very last one is on the 28th, and also a Mercury dynamic to close the month. You're going to see Mercury in Pisces going through a little bit of a sextile to Uranus. And that's, again, a feeling of there being some kind of spike in, creativity, and in terms of our ability to express ourselves, the uniqueness of our thoughts and ideas, communications being a little bit more eccentric, but possibly interesting and outside of the, kind of outside of the norm or status quo. Possible for some intellectual communicative breakthroughs, and even like inventing some new way of doing something, that could be indicated too. Okay, so I think that wraps it up for the month. I'd love to hear from you guys and hear how your month goes. A lot of big transits this month. I'd love to hear how you did last month and how you're doing as this month goes on, and share your stories. And I love hearing from people and how the transits actually play out as the month goes on. So be sure to come back, re-listen, and share your stories as each transit unfolds. So I hope you guys have a great month of February, and stay tuned because I'll be doing my sun and rising sign horoscopes for February shortly. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.